In this video, we're going to find ourselves talking about 1982's The Thing, directed by John Carpenter, which stars Kurt Russell as R.J. McCready, Keith David as Childs, Wilford Brimley as Blair, T.K. Carter as Knowles, David Clennon as Palmer, Richard Dysart as Copper, Charles Hallahan as Norris, Peter Maloney as Bennings, Donald Moffat as Gary, Thomas Waits, not to be confused with the singer, as Windows, Joel Polis as Fuchs, and Richard Major as Clark. Development of The Thing is a little lengthy. It all started when David Foster and Lawrence Terman suggested adapting John W. Campbell's novella Who Goes There to Universal Pictures in the mid-1970s. The novella had been previously adapted in Howard Hawks' 1951 film The Thing from Another World, but Foster and Terman wanted to stick closer to the source material. The rights were held by screenwriters Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, but they passed on the opportunity to make a new film, so Universal managed to obtain the rights from them. In 1976, however, Wilbur Stark had purchased the remake rights to 23 films from RKO Pictures, one of which was The Thing from Another World. Universal then had to acquire the rights to remake the film from Stark, which resulted in him receiving executive producer credits on all advertisement prints, posters, commercials, and press materials. John Carpenter was first approached in 1976 by his friend Stuart Cohen, who was co-producer on the film. But Carpenter, being a predominantly independent film director, was passed over by Universal in favor of Tobe Hooper. Hooper and his writing partner, Kim Henkel, presented a concept that Universal wasn't really happy with, and after a few more failed pitches from different writers and attempts to bring in other directors like John Landis, the project was put on hold. Carpenter finally became loosely attached to the film following the success of his own Halloween, and the success of Ridley Scott's 1979 film Alien kind of revitalized interest in sci-fi horror movies. Carpenter, however, had been reluctant to get on board because he felt that Hawks' film was difficult to surpass, but he considered the monster to be forgettable. After reading the original novella at the suggestion of Cohen, he found the creepiness of the imitations and the questions it raised to be interesting. He found that Who Goes There to be a timeless story that he could make true to this day, much like Hawks did in his film. Carpenter brought on cinematographer Dean Cundey, who he had worked with on Halloween, and for both men, The Thing was their first big-budget studio film. And then Carpenter almost quit, because he had a passion project, El Diablo, that he thought was on the cusp of being made by EMI Films, and during this time, replacements like Walter Hill, Sam Peckinpah, and Michael Ritchie were considered. However, development for El Diablo wasn't as close as Carpenter had thought and ended up continuing work on The Thing. The budget was initially $10 million, and of that, $200,000 was set aside for creature effects, the most ever spent on a monster film at the time. Filming was scheduled for 98 days, and Universal's bean counters then estimated that it would require at least $17 million as set plans, which included large set pieces for the scripted death of Bennings, which was later dropped, as it was estimated to cost $1.5 million alone. Storyboarding and designs were finalized, and at this point the crew estimated they would need $750,000 for creature effects, which Universal agreed to. Larry Franco, the associate producer responsible for making the budget work, cut the filming schedule and eliminated exterior sites for the on-site shoots, and removed the original Bennings death scene. He also suggested using the destroyed American base as the ruined Norwegian camp, which saved the production roughly $250,000 alone. By the time filming began, the budget was brought down to $11.4 million, with indirect costs bringing the number up to about $14 million. However, the budget for the effects had ballooned to $1.5 million, which then forced the removal of some scenes such as Knowles being confronted by a creature that was called the Box Thing. When everything was said and done, though, the film had a final cost of $12.4 million, and the overheads brought the budget to $15 million. Several writers had written drafts before Carpenter became involved, examples being William F. Nolan, David Wiltse, and Hooper and Henkel. Carpenter thought the existing scripts were awful, making the story something it was not, and ignored the impersonation abilities of the creature. Carpenter did not want to write, though, as he had recently completed work on Escape from New York, and was struggling with a screenplay for the Philadelphia Experiment. They again contacted Bill Lancaster, who had met with Terman, Foster, and Cohen in 1977, but at the time he did not want to remake The Thing from Another World. In 79, though, when he was contacted again, he had read Who Goes There, and Carpenter had become involved in the project by this point. So he was hired after describing his vision and wanting to stick closer to the original novella. Lancaster was responsible for things like the Norris Thing biting off Copper's arms and the blood test scenes. Lancaster did say he found some aspects of the novella difficult to translate, most notably the lack of action. Other changes included reducing the number of characters from 37 to 12, and removing a flashback from the novella, which ended up restructuring the film's narrative, which makes the film open in the middle of the action instead of prior to that. And he also modernized the characters for contemporary audiences. After writing around 30 to 40 pages, Lancaster had struggled with the second act of the film, and it took several months for him to complete the script. Upon finishing it, though, Lancaster and Carpenter spent a weekend together refining the script, comparing their ideas for scenes and how the characters should sound. Lancaster kept the creature largely concealed throughout the film, and it was creature effects artist Rob Bottin who convinced Carpenter to show it, as it would have a greater impact on the audience. Lancaster originally had both McCready and Childs turn into the Thing, with the characters being found in the spring by a rescue team. Carpenter didn't really like this ending, though, and opted to end the film with what we see, and he felt the sacrifice to keep the creature from reaching civilization was an ultimate act of heroism by the characters. Surprisingly, before being casted, Kurt Russell was actually involved in the film, as he was helping Carpenter develop some of his ideas, and was ironically the last actor cast in the film in June of 1981, while second unit filming was beginning in Juneau, Alaska. Carpenter had worked with Russell, but wanted to explore his options. There were discussions with Christopher Walken, Jeff Bridges, and Nick Nolte, and they were either unavailable or they had declined. Sam Shepard showed some interest, but was never talked to, and Tom Atkins and Jack Thompson were strong early and late contenders, respectively, for the McCready role. The decision was ultimately made to go with Russell, as Carpenter wanted somebody reliable and would be able to take the difficult conditions that they'd be filming in. Actors that were approached to round out the cast included the likes of Brian Dennehy, Chris Christopherson, John Hurd, Ed Harris, Tom Berenger, Jack Thompson, Scott Glenn, Fred Ward, Peter Coyote, Tom Atkins, and Tom McIntyre. I probably butchered that. For the role of Childs, Jeffrey Holder, Bernie Casey, Isaac Hayes, and Carl Weathers were all considered. Ernie Hudson was even a frontrunner at one point before Keith David came in. While he had an extensive theater background, this was Keith David's first real theatrical role, and he received guidance from Richard Major and Donald Moffat on set, with Major and David even discussing their characters during rehearsal and making the decision that their characters would not like each other. Then unknown, Wilford Brimley was brought in as Blair because of his everyman look and appeal, and would not be questioned by the audience when he disappeared for half the movie. Donald Pleasance was originally considered for the role, but it was soon decided that he was too recognizable for such a role. T.J. Carter was cast as Knowles after Franklin J., a comedian, had come in to read for the role, but rather than actually auditioning, he expressed his belief that the character was a stereotype in a lengthy speech that soon ended the meeting. Creature effects artist Rob Bottin had wanted to play Palmer and lobbied pretty hard for the role, but he would not be able to act and fulfill his existing duties in the film. Universal had brought in Jay Leno, Gary Shandling, and Charles Fleischer, as they thought a comedian would do the role well, as the character does have some comedic moments. But ultimately, the role went to David Clennon, who was chosen because he could handle the more dramatic moments of his character. Clennon had read for the role of Bennings, but he preferred the Palmer character's blue-collar stoner vibe. For Gary, Powers Booth, Lee Van Cleef, Jerry Orbach, Kevin Conway, Richard Mulligan, and Richard Major had all read for the role, but Major asked to play Clark because of the dialogue, and he wanted to work with the dogs. Brian Dennehy was a strong contender for the role of Dr. Copper, but Carpenter decided to go with Richard Dysart at the last minute. The character of Windows was originally named Sanchez, and then later on in revisions of the script was named Sanders. But after Thomas Waits was cast, and during a wardrobe fitting decided to put on the large-rimmed glasses that the character sometimes wear, the name was changed to Windows. Cinematographer Dean Cundy advocated for using anamorphic format aspect ratio because he believed it would allow for the placing of more actors in the environment, and it would make use of the scenery available to them, but also create a sense of confinement within the imagery. It would also let the filmmakers use the negative space around the actors to imply that maybe something is lurking just off screen. Principal photography started on August 24th, 1981 in Juneau, Alaska, with filming lasting around 12 weeks. Filming eventually moved to the Universal lot, and while the crew considered building the sets inside a refrigerated structure, one that was large enough could not be located. So while it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside, they had to cool the sets to 28 degrees Fahrenheit to accommodate their work. Humidifiers and misters were brought in to keep the humidity in the air. After watching an assembly cut of what they had filmed to date, Carpenter decided that the film featured too many scenes of the men standing around and talking. He proceeded to rewrite some of the scenes to be outdoors, and shot on location when filming moved to Stewart, British Columbia. And on December 2nd, 1981, a crew of 100 American and Canadian crew moved into the area to begin filming, with some staying in small mining towns during filming and some living in residential barges in the Portland Canal. There was a 27-mile drive to the Alaskan sets. The sets in Alaska had been erected in the summer so that when the snow season started, it would cover the buildings and help give them a look that they were in the Antarctic. The sets were used for both indoor and outdoor shooting, but the sets would not be heated because if they got the temperature inside above freezing temps, then they'd melt the snow on the buildings, and they didn't want that aesthetic. Outside temperatures were so low that the camera lenses would freeze to the point of breaking and had to be left in the freezing temperatures because if they warmed up and then they were brought outside to film, the lenses would fog up and it would take hours for them to clear up. Weather also was a problem and caused filming to take 3 weeks to complete for the outdoor scenes because some days were canceled due to heavy snow. Several scenes were cut from the script either because of too much dialogue that ruined the pacing or the suspense, and Carpenter shouldered the blame for this, citing issues with his method of directing, and noted that some scenes repeated events or information from previous scenes. A scene involving a snowmobile and the dogs was removed, and the scene with MacReady's monologue was not in the script but added for expositional purposes, and to show MacReady having a heroic side after stepping up as the leader. While Lancaster excelled at ensemble pieces, there were moments in the script that Carpenter didn't particularly care for, like a scene where a body falls into view at the Norwegian camp, as Carpenter felt that this was cliché. MacReady inflating a blow-up doll and playing with it absent-mindedly while the teams watching the Norwegian videos was not used either. Scenes of expanded or alternate character deaths were filmed, such as a scene showing Fuchs impaled on a wall with a shovel. There was also a scene in the climax where Knowles was supposed to be seen as a partly assimilated mass. Carpenter struggled with conveying what being assimilated meant, and as this would be shown in the original scripted version of Benning's death, the scene was deemed far too complex and expensive to film. The last-minute decision to film Benning's death, as we see it, showed how partial assimilation by the Thing worked. Multiple endings were filmed, one of which was a happier ending, as editor Tom Ramsey thought that the nihilistic film would not go well with audiences. There was an alternate ending with MacReady being rescued and given a blood test, but Carpenter thought that this would be too cheesy. Editor Verna Fields was given the task of reworking the ending and to add some clarity and resolution before it was decided to create an ending which removed Childs and left MacReady as the only survivor. This ending tested slightly better and was set to go to print before Carpenter, the producers, and executive Helena Hacker decided that the film was better with a more ambiguous ending between MacReady and Childs. Unlike Carpenter's previous films, he did not write the score. Veteran composer Ennio Morricone was brought in to compose the film's score as Carpenter wanted a more European approach. Carpenter met Morricone in Rome to convince him to take the job. Morricone had composed some music and had a tape with synthesizer music ready for the time he arrived in Los Angeles to record the score. Morricone wrote both orchestral and synth scores and a combined score, as was Carpenter's preference. Carpenter picked a piece for the main theme used in the film and played his score from Escape from New York to convey to Morricone what he wanted. Morricone wrote more music for the film, and allegedly there's around an hour of music that was not used, but is part of the film score that was released. Carpenter and collaborator Alan Holworth developed some synth ideas to further flesh out the music in the film. Often one of the most talked about aspects of the film is the creature effects, and creature effects artist Rob Bottin. Bottin had previously worked on Carpenter's The Fog and joined the production for The Thing in mid-1981, while pre-production was in progress. Artist Dale Cuypers? I don't know. I'm bad with names sometimes. Had been working on some paintings for the creature, but had to leave the project when he was hospitalized due to a traffic accident. It was Bottin that had the idea that the creature should be constantly changing, which Carpenter had considered too weird, so he had him work with artist Mike Plug to conceptualize the creature. Bottin's team increased to 35 people, and Bottin found it hard to manage that number of people, so Eric Jensen, who had done work on The Howling, was brought in to oversee the special effects makeup team. As Bottin had felt that this creature had been around the galaxy, it gave them the freedom to use different attributes from different animals and creatures where they wanted, like stomachs that become mouths, to spider legs on the Norris thing's head, and some of the other weirdness that's present in the movie. Bottin at one point admitted that he wasn't sure how to implement his designs practically, but Carpenter didn't reject anything. Carpenter, for his part, wanted to stay away from the guy in a suit that was usually the monster in a movie. During filming, Bottin, who was 21 at the time, was hospitalized for exhaustion, a bleeding ulcer, and double pneumonia from overworking himself, as he wanted to be directly involved in many of the tasks at hand. He had spent over a year living on the Universal lot and claims to have not taken any time off, opting to sleep on sets or in locker rooms. Due to this, and to alleviate some of the pressure on the crew, Stan Winston was brought in to do some work, most notably the scene in the dog kennel. Without the benefit of a pre-production period, Winston opted to use a hand puppet with radio-controlled eyes and cable-controlled legs. Lance Anderson was the hand puppet operator and endured having KY jelly leaking on him and had to wear a helmet to protect himself from squibs used during the gunfire portions of the scene. Anderson was also responsible for moving the tentacles around, in which reverse filming was used for some parts. Winston, to his credit, refused credit for the work as he insisted that Botten deserved sole credit for the film. Winston did, however, receive a thank you in the film's credits. For the scene where the Norris thing bites off Copper's arms, Botten had found a double amputee and fitted him with prosthetics filled with wax bones, rubber veins, and jello. The arms were placed in the mouth of the Norris thing, and when the jaws closed, the actor pulled away, which severed the fake arms. The Norris thing's head was a little harder to accomplish, and Botten had tested it for months before he was satisfied with the effect. The Blair thing was to be done largely with stop motion by Randall William Cook, who created a miniature model of the set and filmed wide-angle shots of the monster through stop-motion techniques. Carpenter wasn't a fan of the effect, though, as he felt that it wasn't convincing and didn't use much of what was filmed, and instead opted to use a puppet, which took 50 people to operate. Botten worked closely with Cundy to find the right lighting for each creature that appears in the film. Cundy wanted to make sure that the detailing in Botten's work could be seen, but was also aware that showing too much would reveal that it was a puppet and break the suspension of disbelief. They planned each scene that would feature a creature to take place in part of the set that could use small lights to highlight each particular creature's details and textures, while also lighting the creature from behind to catch its overall shape. Cundy also worked with Panasonic and some other companies to develop a camera that was capable of automatically adjusting light exposure at different film speeds, as he wanted to film the creature at faster and slower speeds because he felt that this would prove to be an interesting visual effect. This, however, was unable to be accomplished at the time due to cost. To help visualize the coldness of the exterior sets, Cundy lit them with a blue light that's usually found on airport runways. The snow reflecting the light back helped to increase the impression of coldness to the audience. The Thing opened in 8th place at the box office on June 25, 1982, behind other classic horror film Poltergeist, which was in its 4th weekend at the box office. After 3 weeks, it had dropped out of the top 10, but by the end of its box office run, it had made $19.6 million, compared to its $15 million budget. It was the 42nd highest-grossing film of 1982, and while not considered a flop, it was not well received. Critics largely did not like the film, usually citing the nihilism, and many felt the film was gross and over the top with the special effects. Roger Ebert, in an instance where I really disagree with him, called the movie a barf bag movie, also saying that the film lacked characterization and that some characters were just stereotypes and only there to be killed. Some critics did, however, praise Botten's work on the film, calling it genius, colorfully horrific, and that Botten was a master of the macabre. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post specifically mentioned the Norris Thing chest chomp scene as appalling creativity and that the head detaching was madly macabre. Some critics felt the creature effects were too phony looking to be disgusting, while others just thought they were disgusting. Carpenter had lost a directing job for Firestarter, and while his previous work had earned him a multiple film contract with Universal, they opted to buy him out after The Thing. While he continued to make films, he had lost confidence, and did not talk about The Thing's failure until 1985 in an interview with Starlog. Wilbur Stark also sued Universal to the tune of $43 million for slander, breach of contract, fraud, and deceit. He alleged that he incurred a financial loss because Universal had failed to properly credit him in the marketing and a less prestigious position having his name in the film's credits. David Foster said that Stark was not involved with the film's production and was properly credited in all materials related to the film. Stark also sued over Foster's comments for an additional $15 million, but the outcome of these lawsuits is unknown as of right now. While The Thing wasn't a box office hit, it became a cult hit on VHS and later cable airings. Over the years, the status of the film has continued to grow, with many citing the movie as ahead of its time and a masterpiece of suspense. The film is in the 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die list and is referred to in a variety of media, from TV shows like The X-Files and Stranger Things to video games like Resident Evil 4 and films like Slither, The Mist, and The Faculty. Filmmakers like J.J. Abrams, Guillermo del Toro, Quentin Tarantino, Neil Blomkamp, and more have cited the movie as an influence on their own work. The film has been the subject of numerous thematic analysis videos, uncountable amounts of theory videos on YouTube and other forms of media. Seriously, just type in The Thing theory and you'll find anything from the whiskey bottle theory, numerous videos on who was a thing when they were assimilated, and on the creature itself. A sequel video game was made that was generally well received and continued the plot after the events of the film, and a prequel was released in 2011. This film is a story for a whole nother video. Frank Darabont was to produce a sequel series for the Sci-Fi Channel in 2005, written by David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick, which would follow a group of Russians that recovered the corpses of Childs and McCready and the Thing before the story jumps forward 23 years and the Thing had escaped in New Mexico. The miniseries never happened, and Universal moved on with what would become the 2011 film. The film opens in Antarctica as a Norwegian helicopter is in pursuit of a sled dog. A passenger on the helicopter is taking rifle shots at the dog and eventually resorts to using explosives. The pursuit eventually takes him to an American research station, and as the pilot attempts to throw a grenade at the dog, he drops it in the snow. The surviving Norwegian takes shots at the dog and yells at the Americans, but none of them understand what he's saying. Bennings is wounded by the Norwegian before Station Commander Gary shoots and kills the Norwegian. In an attempt to figure out what is going on, the Americans decide to investigate the Norwegian base, helicopter pilot R.J. McCready and Dr. Copper being the ones to go out and see what they can find. At the Norwegian base, it was largely destroyed by fire. They find frozen corpses, some log tapes, and the charred remains of some kind of humanoid creature. They bring the remains and the logs back to the camp where Dr. Blair performs autopsies on the remains.
Well, what we got here is what appears to be, anyway, a normal set of internal organs. Heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, intestines. Seem to be normal.
Meanwhile, after wandering the camp all day and being alone with a couple members of the team, the dog the Norwegians are trying to kill is finally kennelled with the rest of the American team's dogs by Clark. Shortly after he leaves, the dog starts to behave oddly. Commotion brings Clark back into the room, who's horrified, and McCready, hearing the dogs barking, activates the station's alarms. McCready and a few others arrive at the kennels and are horrified by the scene before them. When the others show up, they incinerate the creature, and Blair takes those remains and autopsies them as well. Between the two creatures, he learns that whatever these things are, they can perfectly imitate other organisms. The logs that were recovered by the Norwegians show that they had found an extraterrestrial spacecraft below the ice and excavated it. There was also a smaller dig site where they found the corpse of an unknown life form. Norris deduces that the ship had been under the ice for around 100,000 years. Blair, meanwhile, begins to grow paranoid after running simulations that show the possibility that one or more of the team members could have been assimilated, and that if the creature makes it to civilization, worldwide assimilation of all life on Earth was possible in just a few years. The team moves the corpses to the storage room, and Fuchs asks McCready to have a word with him in the Snowcat. While Fuchs explains that he has concerns about Blair's mental state, and that his notes show that the cellular activity of the remains is still active, indicating they are still alive, Bennings is left alone in the storage room where the remains, which are indeed alive, begin to assimilate him. By the time the team gathers in the storage room, Bennings is gone. They find him outside, but the assimilation process is not complete, and McCready proceeds to burn him. During this, though, Blair sabotages the vehicles to prevent anybody from leaving, kills the remaining dogs, and begins destroying the communications equipment. A standoff ensues before Blair is subdued and taken to the tool shed. As paranoia grows, Copper suggests a blood test to see who is human and who is not. But when the untainted blood is to be retrieved, it is discovered that somebody sabotaged it.
Will that test have worked, Doc?
Oh, I think so. Somebody else sure thought so.
Well, who else could have used that key?
Nobody. I just give it to Copper whenever he needs it.
Could anybody have gotten it from you, Doc?
I don't see how. As soon as I'm finished, I return it right away.
Gary is looked at suspiciously by the whole team, and it falls to McCready to lead the guys. Fuchs goes missing after he discovers ripped-up clothes with McCready's name on them. During the search, McCready, Windows, and Knowles finds him, having apparently committed suicide to avoid being assimilated by the creature.
Great! Now what are we gonna do? You go inside, tell the others we found Fuchs. We'll be in as soon as we can.
Where are we going?
Up to my shack.
What the hell for?
Because when I left yesterday, I turned the lights off.
Knowles returns without McCready, having found ripped clothes with McCready's name on them, and feared that McCready had been assimilated. As he informs the team of this, McCready does make it back into the base, and a standoff ensues. During a tense back and forth and an eventual physical struggle between McCready and the rest of the group, Norris suffers a heart attack. As Copper works on Norris to try to get his heart back in the rhythm, he begins using a defibrillator. McCready burns Norris, but his head pulls off to try to escape from being burned.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Afterwards, the team regroups and suspicion about McCready comes up again. McCready threatens to kill Childs, but Clark attempts to attack McCready from behind, forcing McCready to shoot him in the head. McCready has deduced from what happened with Norris that every part of the creature will fight to stay alive, and believes that taking fresh blood samples and putting a hot piece of wire in them will prove who is and isn't a thing. Windows passed the test. Palmer, however,
Get away from me! McCready! What is it?
Palmer attacks Windows, infecting him. Once Palmer is dealt with, McCready is forced to incinerate Windows before he can be fully assimilated. The test goes on and the rest of the team passes.
I know you gentlemen have been through a lot. And when you find the time, I'd rather not spend the rest of this winter tied to this fucking couch!
They decide to test Blair, and McCready, Gary, and Knowles go to do this, with Childs being left behind to guard the entrance, instructed that if Blair returns without them, that he is to kill him. Upon reaching the tool shed, the men find that Blair is missing, and begin to investigate the area, and finding a tunnel beneath it, which leads them to a makeshift spacecraft resembling a flying saucer that has been built. Upon returning to the base, Childs is now missing and the power goes out. McCready believes that since they destroyed the craft, the creature now wants to just freeze and go back into hibernation until an opportunity presents itself to escape. The remaining team members decide to detonate dynamite and use Molotov cocktails around the base to destroy both the base and hopefully the creature. While setting explosives in the generator room, Blair appears behind Gary, killing him, and Knowles just disappears. McCready is attacked by the Blair thing, which destroys the detonator. But McCready manages to trigger the detonation by using a stick of dynamite to ignite the other explosives. As the camp burns, an exhausted McCready sits down near a fire and is approached from behind by Childs, who claims that he saw Blair and got lost pursuing him. And that's the thing in a nutshell. I've seen this movie numerous times, and it's not just one of my favorite horror movies, but also one of my favorite movies, period. The more I've viewed this movie, the more I've picked up on things. For example, when Windows walks in on Bennings being assimilated and drops the keys that were later used to destroy the blood, I eventually realized that if you watch Windows in that scene, when they are trying to figure out what happened to the blood, he's upset. Because he realizes that it is his fault because he lost the keys. But he doesn't want to admit this to the others, as they may suspect him of being a thing. It wasn't until I watched the movie on DVD in the early 2000s that I noticed the whole no breath thing with Childs at the end of the film. But to me, the biggest giveaway at the end is that when everybody was paranoid about who could be infected or not be infected, it was suggested that they make their own meals. Childs takes the bottle of whiskey from MacReady and drinks it without a second thought. That to me is the biggest giveaway that shows that Childs was assimilated. And while it could be argued that by that point neither Childs nor MacReady had anything left to lose, it could be assumed that they probably would rather die than be assimilated, so why take the risk by sharing a bottle of whiskey? This is why I think MacReady chuckles to himself when Childs takes a drink, and you also hear the ominous thing music. MacReady realizes his suspicion is correct because if Childs wasn't infected, he likely wouldn't have taken the drink from the bottle. A common thing about horror movies that you'll find in the movies that I really enjoy is that they manage to keep the tension going. Obviously, subsequent viewings of the film, like this, are not as tense as your initial viewing, but Carpenter masterfully crafts a film that shows these guys losing their shit over the situation they are in, their growing distrust of each other over who could be assimilated. While there is some stereotypes on display here, the cast does well, and does the best with what they have. The characters are generally deep enough that you know them, and while it could be argued that some, if not all of them, don't have sweeping character arcs, do they really need to? This is a film that takes place in the span of maybe 24 hours? I mean, how much could these guys possibly change? The characters are fleshed out enough to differentiate them from each other and make them unique and memorable enough that they stand out, much like the characters in a film like Alien, as much as I hate to make the comparison. The creature effects are spectacular, and it should be noted that a 38-year-old movie holds up better visually than the 2011 film does. Rob Bottin and Stan Winston, who did work for the kennel scene, created creatures that were both unique and memorable. Hell, I have the McFarlane Toys Blair and Norris creatures on my shelf because they're just that cool. Much like movies like Alien before it and Predator after it, we are presented with an alien creature that the likes of which we have never seen before. This is not your typical The Greys alien. This was a shape-shifting, vicious, and animalistic creature. If I had any negatives to level at the film, it would be the final encounter with the Blair monster. It plays out very fast, and even as kind of some action movie cliches with the one-liner and shit from Kurt Russell. And while I get that they had some limitations due to Carpenter not liking the stop motion, they could only do so much with the puppet. It's more so Kurt Russell that I find kind of bugs me in the sequence, with the weird role that he does, and yeah, well, fuck you too. While this doesn't destroy the experience for me, nor should it for anybody, it does seem kind of tonally out of place compared to what we had seen in the film up to that point. There are some audio edits that seem a little dated, and this is just mostly ADR work, specifically like when Blair's destroying the radio equipment. Again, not so much a negative tick on the movie as this is a movie from 1982 and it's just something that is in some of these older movies. I have the same issue with parts of Alien, for example. All in all, John Carpenter's Thing is a masterpiece. It builds its world, establishes the characters, and manages to get you to know and differentiate between the 12 characters. And once the tension begins to ratchet up, it doesn't let up. Beneath the surface, you can dive deep into this movie, and there are so many little things, whether intentional or not, that can lead you down a rabbit hole of all kinds of theories about clothes changing mysteriously and how and when the assimilated were assimilated and more. While the movie can leave you with some questions, they aren't questions that destroy the film and leave you with an incomplete narrative. It's more like questions that let you fill in the blanks as you see fit. None of this was captured in the prequel film from 2011, which really it answered questions that didn't need answered. We already knew the answers for the most part. And if anything, it contradicted elements of Carpenter's film. Keep in mind, though, that as much good as I've said about this movie and as much as I love it, this is not a feel-good movie. This is not a movie that has an ending that wraps everything up in a nice little package, nor does it leave you with a feeling of hope for the survivors, and that's okay. While the film is a nihilistic, apocalyptic film, the themes that it tackles expertly, and it deserves its place on the 1001 movies you must see before you die. If by some chance you've never seen John Carpenter's The Thing, first of all, what the fuck are you doing here? And second of all, go watch it.